Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. This video is all about how to photograph Marsh Harriers, and it's going to cover two aspects really. So the one aspect is going to be the camera settings that we need to take successful photographs of Marsh Harriers, and then the other aspect is the biology and the behaviour of Marsh Harriers, because I will have mentioned this many times on this channel, but the more you know about the animal you're photographing, the better those pictures are going to be. So we need to know the sort of habitats they like to hunt and live in. And when it comes to Marsh Harriers in the UK, Marsh Harriers really like open areas, reed beds. If you look behind me, we've got extensive reed beds here, and they'll hunt in the reed beds or over the reed beds, and in actual fact they also nest in the reed beds. So the first thing we need to know is what sort of habitat do Marsh Harriers like, and once we know that, then we can obviously start to pick the areas where we've got a good chance of seeing Marsh Harriers. So the first thing is habitat. Where do they hunt? Where do they nest? Where do they basically hang out? And in the case of UK Marsh Harriers, that will be open areas, especially with extensive reed beds. Marsh Harriers live until they're about 6 years old, and the survival rate from fledgling to adult is not that great. Only about 15% make it through to the third year. And when it comes to mating, you see often this fantastic aerial mating ritual where the male will pass food mid-air to the female. And I've not photographed that yet, but that's something I really do want to photograph. When they do mate, they normally nest on the ground in the reed beds, normally lay about 4 to 5 eggs, and I think the incubation is about 33 to 35 days, and then they fledge after about 35 to 38 days, maybe 40 days. And as I say, the survival rate is not that great. Only 15% make it through to the third year. So the ones you are seeing are really strong, you know, birds that have made it through so many different challenges. Now, when it comes to photographing Marsh Harriers, we'll talk about all the technical stuff in a minute. The first thing we need to think about is, are we going to shoot or are we going to photograph these birds either statically, you know, sort of perching on a post, or in flight? And generally it's going to be in flight, because that's where you most often see Marsh Harriers. As I've already mentioned, you're most likely to see Marsh Harriers in flight, especially when they're sort of moving around over the reed beds hunting. And the sort of prey they take are small birds, small mammals, frogs, insects, even fish sometimes. So really anything that's sort of a reasonable, you know, not massive, a reasonable size they'll take. And they spend a lot of time in the air hunting the reed beds for that type of prey. So when it comes to photographing these guys, we want a fast enough shutter speed to freeze the motion in flight. So I would suggest going for a 1/2000th of a second. Now we can probably get away with 1,000th of a second because they're not that fast, and as long as you pan with the animal, 1,000th of a second will probably be okay. A 2,000th of a second will certainly be okay. And if you've got enough light, then I would probably go for 2,000th of a second. If the light's low though, it might be worth experimenting with 1,000th of a second, because that will reduce your ISO. Because the slower the ISO, the higher the ISO, sorry, the more digital noise we get, and I'm sure you're all aware of that. And if we can reduce that digital noise by shooting with a lower ISO, that's a good thing. But if it means we're going to get a blurred picture because the shutter speed is too slow, then that's worse than having a high ISO and digital noise. So the key thing is shoot with a fast enough shutter speed to freeze the motion of that animal and avoid camera shake, regardless of what the ISO is. Now, if we can reduce the ISO by shooting with a slightly slower shutter speed but still get sharp pictures, then that is also a bonus. It's like a win-win situation. So I would suggest to experiment with 1,000th of a second and a 2,000th of a second. Now it depends on the amount of light there is around, but if you can stop the lens down by 2/3 of a stop, so let's say you've got an f5.6 lens, if you can stop it down to f7.1 aperture, that will make the picture slightly sharper, but obviously that will increase the ISO. So if the light levels are low, then go wide open on the lens and shoot at 1,000th of a second, and then shoot at a 2,000th of a second if you've got the opportunity and it's not just a fleeting encounter. And focusing modes, I will be shooting now with my Z8, my Nikon Z8, bird eye tracking. If you haven't got bird eye tracking, then what I would go for is a small group of autofocus points that you can move around from left to right. And of course, if the bird is on the right hand side of the frame going left, you'd have the AF points on the right hand side. If it's flying this way, you'd have the autofocus points on this side of the frame, so it's moving into that negative space. And then it's just a case of having a decent panning technique. So when you've got the camera and the lens like this, just twist the body. So I would normally twist at the waist and pan with that animal, which means you're going to get a sharper shot at slightly slower shutter speed. So just pan with the direction of movement. And that's about it really. Fast enough shutter speed to freeze the motion. Stop the lens down if you can. Pick continuous focusing, so AFC or servo if you're a Canon user. If you've got eye tracking, engage eye tracking. If you haven't got eye tracking, as it's a bird in flight, I will go for a small group of autofocus points instead of one single autofocus point, because sometimes trying to get a single AF point on a bird's head is really difficult. Whereas if you've got like a group of 4 or 5 autofocus points, if you miss getting that center point on the bird's head, one of the points around the outside of that active autofocus point will pick it up. So it's not quite as accurate, but it gives you a little bit more wiggle room when it comes to getting sharp pictures of that bird in flight. The males and females have got different colouring. So the females are like a chocolatey brown with cream faces and cream wingtips, and the males are more of a sort of russet brown with grey parts. So they are completely different when it comes to looks. And the female is a bit bigger than the male. They've got about 122 centimetre wingspan, so they're reasonably large birds. As I say, I think I might have mentioned already, about a buzzard size, but it's not as chunky. They're bigger than a kestrel, probably a bit smaller than a red kite, but they're a decent sized bird. They look fantastic. The females weigh about 670 grams and the males about 544 grams. So, but they're a fantastic bird to photograph. And as I say, the females are very different to the male, so it's easy to tell the two species apart. And you'll just see them gliding over the reed beds. They're not a fast moving bird, so it's not like trying to photograph a fast moving swallow. They're quite a lazy, languid movement, which means tracking Marsh Harriers in flight is not too difficult. You still need good technique, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but yeah, they're not the fastest bird in flight, and they've got lovely lazy flapping wings, and sometimes they'll hover. They won't hover like a kestrel hovers, but sometimes you get a little bit of hovering as they look down on the into the reed beds to look for prey.